Picture a Roman city nearly 2,000 years ago. Steam fills the air inside a grand public bathhouse. Outside, the streets are alive with merchants, soldiers, and citizens. But inside, the rooms stay warm, even on a cold day. Along one wall is something almost nobody in history has ever seen before. A thick, cloudy sheet of greenish glass. You couldn't read through it. You couldn't admire the view through it. But it did something that changed the way people lived forever. For the first time, sunlight could enter a room without the wind, the rain, or the cold coming with it. It seems ordinary today, but for almost all of human history, a window wasn't made of glass at all. It was simply a hole in the wall. And solving that one simple problem would take thousands of years of invention, forgotten technologies, impossible engineering challenges, and even one government that decided to tax daylight itself. So how did we go from a simple hole in the wall to the crystal clear glass we barely notice today? Let's find out. It all begins in ancient Rome. Rome, around the year 79, inside a grand bathhouse in the shadow of a mountain that is about to erase a city. Warm light falls across the floor, through a small, thick pane of greenish glass set into the wall. It is cloudy and uneven. You could not read a page through it, but it holds back the wind, keeps in the heat, and lets a little of the sun inside. For the wealthy Romans standing in that steam, it is a small miracle. That pane of glass is one of the first true windows in human history, and that is where our story begins. For almost all of human existence, a window was simply a hole, an opening cut into a wall to let in air and light, and to let out smoke from the fire inside. The problem was obvious. An open hole lets in everything else too: cold, rain, wind, insects. So people covered these openings with whatever they had: wooden shutters, animal hides, cloth, thin sheets of polished stone, or even stretched animal skin. Every one of these came with the same cruel trade. You could have light, or you could have shelter. You could not have both. Open the shutter, and the weather poured in. Close it, and sit in darkness. Some cultures found clever partial answers. Thin sheets of translucent stone, like the mineral selenite, could be fitted into frames to let a soft, dim glow pass through while blocking the wind. Others used oiled paper or scraped animal skin that let a little light seep in. But none of it was truly transparent. You could not see through these coverings, only sense the daylight behind them. For the vast majority of people, a home was a dim place, lit more by the fire and the open door than by any window. The word itself remembers this. Window comes from Old Norse roots meaning wind and eye, an eye for the wind, a hole that watched the weather. That is what a window was for thousands of years. So how did we get from a hole in the wall to the clear glass we barely notice today? The answer starts with the Romans, and with a single technique that changed what glass could be. Glass itself was ancient. People in Egypt and Mesopotamia had been shaping it into beads and vessels for well over 1,000 years. But making glass and making a flat, clear pane for a window are two very different problems. Around the 1st century, Roman glassmakers mastered glassblowing, a method they inherited and refined from earlier craftsmen. By blowing air into a glob of molten glass, they could shape it far faster and in far greater quantity than before, and the glass industry boomed. With that skill, they began making flat glass for windows. Some panes were cast in molds, poured, a nad left to set. Others were blown into cylinders that were cut open and flattened while still hot into rough sheets. These panes were far from perfect. They were thick, often greenish from the iron in the sand, and rarely fully transparent. Most were used in bathhouses and the villas of the rich, where holding in heat mattered as much as letting in light. Roman glass was a luxury and a status symbol, restricted to the wealthy and to grand public buildings. An ordinary home would never have seen it. But the Romans had proven something. Glass could fill a window. The idea was now loose in the world. And then, for a while, much of that knowledge slipped away. When the Western Roman Empire declined, many of its glass-making techniques faded across Europe. So what happened to the window during the centuries that followed? For most people, it went backward. Across the early medieval period, window openings in ordinary buildings were once again left unglazed or covered with shutters, cloth, or thin panels to keep out the cold. Glass did not vanish entirely. In some places, old Roman glass was gathered up, melted down, and reused. At one monastery in southern Italy, glassmakers even melted down the colored tesserae from old Roman mosaics to make new sheets and vessels. Small panes still appeared in the most important buildings, but clear, flat glass for everyday windows remained out of reach for almost everyone. For an ordinary family, the window was still just a shuttered hole, exactly as it had been for their ancestors thousands of years before. There was, however, one place where glass did not merely survive. It flourished, and to see it, you have to step inside a medieval church. From roughly the 10th century onward, stained glass became one of the great art forms of medieval Europe. In the cathedrals of northern France, Germany, and England, colored glass filled enormous windows with light and story. Think about what that glass was doing for the people who saw it. Most could not read. And here, glowing above them, were the scenes of their faith, rendered in light itself. The window had become a teacher, a storyteller, a source of wonder. The colors came from the glass itself. Impurities, such as iron oxide, tinted it, and craftsmen learned to add minerals to create deep blues and rich reds. The small panes were held together with strips of lead, arranged into vast and intricate designs. For centuries, this was the pinnacle of the window. Not clarity, but color. Not a view of the outside world, but a transformed light, falling on the faithful inside. And still, for the ordinary home, a clear glass window was almost unimaginable. So what finally brought glass down from the cathedral and into the house? The answer lies in how glassmakers, slowly, painstakingly, learned to make a flatter, clearer sheet. One key method was crown glass. A glassblower would gather a glob of molten glass, then spin it rapidly on a rod until it flared out into a large flat disc, a crown. That spinning disc could then be cut into smaller panes. Crown glass was clearer and better in quality than the older broad glass, which is part of why it spread. But it had a flaw. The spinning left the glass uneven, thin at the edges and thick in the center. That thick center is the swirled bullseye you still see in the windows of very old buildings. Once a flaw of the manufacturing process, now a charming signature of age. The medieval centers of Venice and Normandy guarded these methods as closely held trade secrets. There was another method too, called broadsheet. A glass blower would blow a large cylinder of glass, then cut it open along its length and unroll it flat while it was still soft. It made bigger sheets, but they were often cloudy and full of imperfections. Each technique was a small step in the same long struggle. How do you take a blob of molten glass and turn it into something flat, clear, and large enough to see through? For century after century, the answer was slowly, imperfectly, and at great expense. Through the Tudor and Stuart periods, glass windows in homes were still mostly the privilege of the noble and wealthy. They used small panes set into a complex latticework of lead, because large, even sheets simply could not yet be made. By the 1600s and 1700s, though, glass was slowly becoming more common in ordinary buildings, not just churches and palaces. And a new design was about to change the shape of the window forever. That design was the sash window. Panes of glass held in a wooden frame that could slide up and down. It let in light and controlled air, with an elegance the old shutters never could. It became a defining feature of Georgian architecture. For the first time, the window was becoming something we would recognize. A frame of glass that lets you see out, keeps the weather off, and opens a gap for fresh air whenever you wish. The window was no longer just an eye for the wind, it was becoming a view. You can still see these windows on Georgian townhouses today, with their neat grids of small square panes. They were small because large sheets were still hard to make, so a big window meant many little panes joined together by slender wooden bars. But here is where the story takes a strange and revealing turn. Just as glass windows were spreading, a government decided to tax them, and that decision would darken homes across a nation for more than a century. In 1696, under King William III, England introduced the window tax. The logic seemed clever at the time. The government wanted to tax people according to their wealth, but many strongly opposed the idea of declaring their personal income to the state. So the government looked for a proxy, something visible, something it could measure without ever entering your home, and the windows were perfect. A bigger house had more windows. More windows meant more wealth. So the tax collector simply counted the windows from the street. It sounds almost reasonable. In practice, it was a disaster that reshaped the buildings of an entire country. Because when you tax something, people find ways to have less of it. The tax was banned. A house with more windows paid more, and over the years, the rates rose again and again, especially during Britain's costly wars. New houses were designed with fewer windows on purpose, built to fall just under the next tax threshold. The effect on glass itself was startling. By 1851, glass production in Britain had barely grown from what it was decades earlier, even as the population exploded, and new houses went up everywhere. A whole industry had been held back by a tax on light. Across Britain, homeowners began bricking up their own windows to lower their tax bills. Walk through old British towns today, and you can still see them. Neat window shapes filled in with brick, blank spaces where daylight used to fall. The physical scars of a tax on light. If you have ever noticed one of those bricked-up windows and wondered why it was there, now you know. And if this kind of hidden history is what you love, this is exactly the sort of thing this channel exists to uncover. The human cost was real. Builders of dense working-class housing used the fewest windows possible to avoid the tax. The result was homes that were dark, airless, and damp. Doctors argued for decades that the lack of light and ventilation was breeding disease. Charles Dickens attacked it. He called it a tax on air and light. In 1850, a group of London doctors petitioned Parliament, arguing with real cases that the tax was literally shortening lives by forcing families to live in darkness. After more than a century and a half, the pressure finally worked. In 1851, the window tax was repealed. One magazine celebrated with a cartoon of a family welcoming a smiling sun through a brand new window. Light, quite literally, was allowed back into people's homes. With the tax gone, and with the Industrial Revolution transforming what factories could produce, the window entered a new age. So what did it take to finally make glass cheap, clear, and available to everyone? Through the 19th century, new manufacturing methods produced larger and flatter sheets of glass than ever before. The old hand-blown techniques gave way, step by step, to machines. Glass began its long journey from luxury to everyday material, and then, in the 20th century, came the breakthrough that made the modern window possible. Its name was the float glass process, and it was the work of a British engineer named Alistair Pilkington. Pilkington's idea, developed through the 1950s, was deceptively simple. Pour molten glass onto a bath of molten tin. The glass floats on the metal, spreads out under its own weight, and cools into a perfectly flat, smooth sheet. There was no need for the expensive grinding and polishing that older plate glass required. The surface came out flawlessly smooth on its own, because it had formed against a perfectly level pool of liquid metal. It took years of patient trials to get right. Controlling the temperature and the atmosphere above the tin was fiendishly difficult, and there was deep skepticism, even inside his own company. But in 1959, the process was announced to the world, and it changed glassmaking forever. For the first time in history, large, flawless, clear sheets of glass could be produced continuously, at industrial scale, and at low cost. Float glass quickly became the global standard. To this day, it is the most widely produced form of glass on Earth, and this is the moment the window truly created the modern world. Cheap, flat, flawless glass did not just improve the home, it transformed the very shape of our buildings and our cities. Look at any modern skyline. The glass towers, the curtain walls, where entire facades are made of glass, hang on a steel frame. None of that is possible without the flat, uniform sheets that float glass, made ordinary. The window stopped being a hole in the wall and became the wall itself, and the same base material could now be transformed in astonishing ways. Tinted to cut the glare of the sun, coated to trap heat inside in winter, layered and toughened for safety. The humble pane became a piece of high technology, quietly doing its work in every building around us. It changed how we live, too. We now understand that natural light is not just pleasant. It affects our health, our mood, our sleep. The very thing a government once taxed, and doctors once fought to restore, we now design our homes and offices to capture as much as we can. Think about how far this journey has traveled, from a hole covered with animal hide, to a thick, greenish pane in a Roman bath, to the glowing color of a cathedral, to a tax that bricked up the light, to a sheet of glass so clear you forget it is even there. That is the strange power of the window. It is the one part of a building whose entire job is to almost disappear, to let the world in while asking you to notice nothing at all. So the next time you sit by a window, watching the rain or the light or the street outside, remember what you are really looking through. Thousands of years of human effort and countless small inventions, all spent to solve one simple, stubborn problem: how to let the light in and keep the weather out. For most of history, that was an impossible dream. Today, it is a pane of glass so ordinary you never think about it. And that, quietly, is one of the ways the window created the modern world.